This is CounterPoint, and I'm your host, Tanya Granic Allen. Today, we're discussing one of the most consequential and increasingly contentious issues in Canada today: immigration policy, national cohesion, and whether Canadians still have a meaningful say in the future of their country. For years, concerns about housing shortages, strained infrastructure, wage suppression, or the pace of population growth were too often dismissed as impolite or even unacceptable to raise in public life. But as pressures mount across the country, many Canadians are beginning to ask whether the Trudeau government fundamentally broke a system that once balanced compassion with the national interest. Our guest today says that the answer is yes in his recent C2C Journal article, The Other Right to Choose: Reversing the Trudeau Immigration Fiasco. Former Chief of Staff to the Federal Minister of Citizenship and Immigration, John Weissenberger, argues that Canada abandoned the disciplined, points-based immigration model that made this country successful, replacing it with an ideologically driven approach that has undermined public confidence, weakened social cohesion, and placed enormous strain on the economy and public services. He also argues that restoring trust will require political leaders willing to say something that used to be obvious: that immigration policy should first and foremost serve the interest of Canadians. Well, joining me now is the author himself, John Weissenberger. John, thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
Okay, well, hopefully I framed this discussion well, but I think this is a very important discussion to be had, probably for the last several years, but definitely right now. So you argue that Canada's immigration system has shifted from being very carefully managed and almost into a nation building project into what you call an ideological experiment. What do you feel specifically changed, and especially under the Trudeau government?
Well, the short answer is numbers. No system is perfect, but prior to 2015, there was a managed system with numbers that were um, kind of balanced or proportional to the economic needs of Canadians and of the country, along with, of course, beyond the purely economic stream of immigrants. I think viewers should know clearly there's also the family stream, reunification of families for people who are already here, and then a refugee stream. So it was a balanced system at numbers that we could accommodate.
And for many Canadians, say even watching the program tonight, and heck, even myself at times, we expect the government will, be running the ship and running it well, obviously in the national public interest. I don't sit up at night think about immigration numbers. That's something the government ought to do. We have a certain trust and confidence that we place in the government to do that. But now, based on what you've written in our discussion we're having today, if previous levels tied to economic need, which seems appropriate, and that has changed, do you think that there is still trust amongst the populace in the federal counterparts to do the job to responsibly manage immigration in Canada?
The dramatic increase in numbers, I think, has really caused people to reflect on this. The economic impact that you indicated in terms of housing, healthcare, and other services that's been strained by the mismanagement of the system, I think really has eroded Canadians' trust.
And a lot of people know I'm a child of immigrants. My parents came to Canada in the 60s, the wave of immigration back then. But they came, they worked hard, they contributed to society, built it up. It seems that there's a different sentiment now towards immigrants, that people really are kind of starting to take pause. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. We only have about 30 seconds between commercial breaks. But do you feel that sentiment has changed, say, with that massive wave in the 60s to now?
Well, look, similar to you, my parents are immigrants. They were refugees in Europe after World War II. I'm the only one of my family born in Canada. So I have some personal insight into this as well. The short answer is yes, people's views have changed.
Welcome back to Counterpoint. We're discussing Canada's immigration policy and what should change, what needs to change, and perhaps what even it's doing right. And joining me for that discussion is John Weissenberger. John, thanks again for joining me. And I'm sorry I had to cut you off before we went to commercial break, but we're discussing kind of the sentiment shift amongst Canadians with previous waves of immigration to the present one. And you were explaining, and I appreciate this context, that you yourself, your parents immigrated, your siblings were not even born here. You're the first one in your family to be born in Canada. So this is an issue that you could definitely have a close relation with.
Yeah, I mean, I go back to the point you made earlier that these are matters that Canadians don't typically think about too much. They assume that the government will be managing immigration in a responsible way, and I think it's only been since the dramatic economic impacts of the last few years that people's attitudes have changed. I think generally in the past there was a consensus, a favorable consensus around immigration. But again, I come back to the sheer numbers, hundreds of thousands, millions of temporary foreign workers, a foreign student program with no numbers cap on it, that has really impacted local communities, again, in terms of say, rental properties. I think that's when it really started to hit home that the system was out of whack.
Yeah, I agree. I think the housing crunch has really shone a light. Now, to their credit, there was some movement on the federal international student permits program. So there has been a cap put in place. Is that like, can you explain a little bit about that? And is that holding? Has that ameliorated the situation for Canadians?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at it critically, the numbers are still too high. What the government is arguing is that the numbers have gone down, but they've gone down from a very high number. So
Right.
they've gone down from a high number to a not so high number.
And what
They're
was that
still higher.
number? Do you have that number handy?
You mean in terms of the economic stream
Like, no,
or
the
the foreign students?
foreign student stream. Like, what was it at its peak in the last couple of years?
Yeah, I want to say there were a couple of million who are here right now. The number and often the excuse me, the numbers are conflated. So both temporary foreign workers and foreign students. So anyone on a temporary permit, that number is in the millions. And I think the number that came out most recently is there are about 500,000 of these temporary permit holders that the government that have not returned. The government doesn't know where they are
Oh,
because
wow.
there's no tracking. So
That's half a million.
it's yeah. These are large numbers, and if you look at and the impact on individual institutions, and I've done some other work on this. The University of Toronto, for instance, since the turn of the century, all of its um, enrollment growth has essentially been foreign students. The domestic enrollment has been flat. So there are all kinds of impacts in all kinds of different sectors.
Well, that's shocking to me as a taxpayer in Ontario, because I know a part of our taxpayer dollars go towards subsidizing our institutions. And again, I appreciate helping everybody in the world in some capacity, but to know that the a lot of people benefiting from university actually are just temporary. They may not even stay in Canada. They may just go back home. Like, I don't know why my tax dollars would go to subsidizing that education. So it's interesting. You also brought up temporary foreign workers, and that has been a real hot button issue lately. Especially as we approach the summer and students are looking to get part-time jobs in some of the urban centers or maybe in the rural communities. How has that program potentially been mismanaged, or what has it done well?
Well, I'm not an economist, but again, some of these issues I think are very basic. if you bring in a lot of lower skilled workers, and we're talking beyond what was typically done in the past, for agriculture, seasonal workers, that kind of thing. But if you just bring in temporary workers to fill a lot of lower skilled jobs, lower paid jobs, clearly those opportunities are not available for Canadians. And as you kind of suggest, there is an impact specifically on, say, summer student positions,
Mhm.
where those are all filled, and I think those are reflected in the youth unemployment figures.
Welcome back to CounterPoint. I'm joined by John Weissenberger as we discuss his latest piece for the C2C Journal, The Other Right to Choose, Reversing the Trudeau Immigration Fiasco. And again, John, thank you so much for being here. Just to remind our audience, you are the former chief of staff to the Minister of Immigration Citizenship in Canada. So you have some, expertise in this matter. So I appreciate that. And when you were working with the ministry, the system, as we discussed, employed then was a points system. How did that work, and why have things changed from a point system? What was the impetus there?
Right. So the point system was set up in the 1960s. The rationale was to develop an objective means of selecting economic immigrant applicants into the country based on the needs of Canadians. So there was a list of about 6 or 8 attributes that was used, things like education, language proficiency, work skills, etc. And the beauty of that was that the criteria were clearly established, and they could be tweaked depending on the economic need in Canada. And that was used very successfully for decades. In fact, it was copied by other countries such as Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and was generally understood to be a good system. Now, I can't speak for the government that succeeded us in 2015. The one thing that again the viewers should understand is those criteria were only used for the economic stream, which is about 50%
Hmm.
of all newcomers. Then you have again family reunification and refugees. But the Trudeau government, for reasons known to them, increased the economic stream by, I want to say, 50%. It was running at about 250,000 people per year under the Harper government, and that um, almost doubled to over 400,000. And then, of course, there are those additional streams of temporary workers and students that we discussed before. So my understanding is that there were still points criteria used,
Hmm.
but it was just a much larger number of people, and clearly they must have loosened, and there's some evidence for this, loosened the oversight and the criteria in order to bring in more people.
And now, obviously, as you mentioned, we don't know the reasons specifically. They would understand why things were done the way they were done. But you also write that the political class, however, also ignored, the warning signs rather on housing, infrastructure, and actually, and we're going to get to this in the last segment, but also social cohesion, which is an important thing. Uh, w- what should they have been paying attention to? I mean, now things after, I guess, a good decade of this new policy, which seems to be, yeah, causing a lot of grief for Canadians, or a lot of Canadians are having concern. They're taking pause. Why now? Why has that tipping point been hit now? And why was it ignored for so long?
Well, again, I don't know why they would have ignored it. I think these problems were foreseeable or predictable. But the way these things often work is they will continue on until they can't continue anymore, until they hit some type of breaking point. So, and I think that's exactly what happened. Now, the logical thing would be to use just the housing stock and other economic metrics. We know, for say medical access to medical care, that's already been a challenge for Canadians who are here,
Right.
let alone for adding hundreds of thousands of newcomers. When I was living in Ontario, um, when I was working in the ministry, couldn't get a family doctor, and that was more than 10 years ago. So these are issues that I think are intuitive, but because I guess of whatever philosophy was motivating the previous government, they just forged ahead, hoping that everything would just kind of work out.
Yeah, and it's not fair to the immigrants either because they come here with an expectation there's a certain healthcare, access to housing, and they themselves were
Right.
finding it's too expensive. We can't cope here. Anyhow, we're going to discuss how massive and unmanaged immigration can have an impact on social cohesion right when we return from this commercial break. Welcome back to CounterPoint. We're continuing our discussion on immigration, and joining me is author of this C2C Journal article, John Weissenberger, The Other Right to Choose, Reversing the Trudeau Immigration Fiasco. John, thanks again for being here. One thing that we need to address is social cohesion. We have seen, especially in Europe, that with rapid and sometimes unmanageable immigration, especially without successful integration, that can undermine social cohesion and obviously public trust and confidence. Is Canada headed on Europe's path, where we have seen in Europe such fragmentation in society?
Well, again, as I um, summarize in the title of the piece, this is a choice. So, ironically, the point system that we discussed a minute ago, if it's applied rigorously by taking predominantly educated, skilled applicants who have prior knowledge of English and/or French, you're already selecting uh, people who can more easily adapt to life in Canada.
Right.
And arguably, students would be the same if you wanted to select, say, from foreign students who've already lived here for a number of years. The challenge comes when you're losing control of the flow, so to speak, and uh, people are coming in who are from cultures that are dramatically different from Canadian culture, in numbers that make it hard for them to integrate.
Right. And again, these are conversations that should be happening that people I think are having in the privacy of their own homes. But it's interesting because the moment someone flags a concern over immigration and mass immigration, they're accused of being anti-immigrant, even if they themselves are immigrants. It's quite interesting. You make the distinction about supporting immigration in principle and opposing, for example, reckless immigration policy, as we sort of discussed here. Why has that distinction been so challenging for for these kinds of discussions to have in Canada? Like, why is this so hard to have that conversation?
Well, it was difficult to have even decades ago, but now, as perhaps better than anyone, the these subjects have become so politicized, so polarized, that it's hard to have an objective discussion, a dispassionate discussion, because, as I mentioned again in the piece, those on the conservative side of the aisle will tend to argue in favor of kind of a measured approach, using criteria similar to the point system we've been discussing. Whereas on the other side of the aisle, there appear to be literally no boundaries in terms of who should come in or how many should come in. And I mentioned the instance where one of my staffers met with a UN um, official to discuss refugee policy. And the point that he made was that Canada had an essentially unlimited capacity to take refugees, which of course is not the case, but it showcases the attitude um, of people like that, and in this case, someone from the UN.
So if you were advising the government right now, because we're not in the Trudeau government now, we have the Mark Carney government. Should be different. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I don't know. If you were to give them, like, say, a few concrete steps if they wanted to better the immigration system, what would you advise them?
Well, we had a system that worked. So you first of all make sure that and again for the viewers, they could have followed the various news stories that have come out over the last few weeks and months. Go back to rigorous criteria. The numbers would have to go down significantly until you achieve some type of balance with the ability of the country to absorb people, whether that's on housing stock, healthcare, whatever metrics you want to use. But um, that would be the most logical approach, in my view.
Okay, John, thank you again for your time. This has been a very enlightening discussion, and I appreciate your time today. This has been Counterpoint. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you the next time.